Afternoon. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. We're going to give folks a couple seconds to hop on and tune in with us, and while we wait, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. My name is Isabella Norrid, and I am a conservation educator here at the Salado Wildlife Education Center. I graduated from the University of Kentucky in December with a degree in natural resources and environmental science, and I began working here at the Salado Center in March. Now, if you saw the teaser video, then you know that today we are going to be discussing native trees and native wildlife, and maybe who lives in a tree. And native and non-native things both live in trees, but today we are only going to be discussing native wildlife. But first, we need to define that word native. When I use the word native, I am referring to wildlife and trees that occur here naturally in Kentucky. That means that they weren't brought here by humans. Now, if you tuned in to Rachel's backyard birding video, then you might have learned about some common songbirds you might see in your backyard here in Kentucky. But if I were to ask you to maybe look at this slide and pick out the things that were native and not native, it might be a little difficult for you, and that's okay. But I'm here to tell you that the North American cardinal is native to the state of Kentucky, while the European starling, like its name, is from Europe. It was brought here by humans. It is not native to the state, but it has since established and actually become a very successful species. Josh, if you would like to hold up the picture of our next species. This is Japanese honeysuckle. It is an example of a shrub that is not native to the state. It's got beautiful white and yellow flowers. It tastes great, it smells great. It's one of my favorite things about summer. I love tasting its nectar, and so do birds, and that is why it is so common across the state of Kentucky, but it is actually considered invasive. Now, wildlife and plants have some basic needs of survival. They have to meet certain needs in order to survive and reproduce. There are 4 basic needs of survival for wildlife. If you think you know them, you can comment them down below. Try to list them off. I'll give you a couple seconds. If you said food, water, and shelter, then so far you would be absolutely correct. Animals need food, water, and shelter to survive. The last one might be a little tricky, but I'm going to help you out. It's space. And if you think about it, space kind of includes all 3 of those first things, food, water, and shelter, together. If you take the white-tailed deer, for example, if we had all of the white-tailed deer in Kentucky living in the same exact space, they might not survive because they're using all of the same resources, all of the same food, water, and shelter. So they're going to need space from each other in order to have adequate resources. So why are we talking about trees today? That is because trees are important habitats for wildlife. Wildlife use trees for many of their survival needs. And just like animals, trees compete for resources. They have to compete for sunlight and space. And the arrangement and availability of these resources is going to determine where we see these on the landscape. Wildlife are going to use trees to their advantage from seed to death. Throughout the entire life cycle, trees are going to be beneficial to wildlife. We have some pictures, Josh, if you would like to show, of the stages, but it goes from seed to sprout, sapling, then we have a mature tree, a dead tree, which is called a snag, which we'll discuss later, and then a rotting log. But from seed to rotting log, wildlife are going to be depending on trees for survival. Now, Kentucky has a lot of habitat diversity and a lot of tree diversity. My favorite way to remember how many trees are native to the state of Kentucky is to think about how many counties we have in our state. I hope you know the answer. If you do, you can comment that below, but the answer is 120. We have over 120 trees that are native to the state of Kentucky, and that has to do with our habitat diversity. The eastern portion of the state is characterized by mountains, while the western portion of the state is flatter and characterized by wetlands. So you might not see the same species in the eastern portion of the state that you do in the western portion of the state, and that is just due to the habitat diversity that we have. The state of Kentucky is largely comprised, 76% of the state is comprised of oak hickory forest. And that is great news for you hunters. That means that the majority of the species you're going to be seeing in the state are in the oak and hickory family. These trees are hard mass producing species, which means they produce nuts and acorns, and wildlife love to eat nuts and acorns. So you hunters and wildlife watchers, you want to have these trees around you or on your property if you want to attract wildlife to your property, like white-tailed deer and wild turkey, maybe squirrels, bear, and raccoons. Now, this wouldn't be a talk about Kentucky native trees, if I didn't mention the tulip tree or the tulip poplar. This is the Kentucky state tree. Here's a photo of the leaf and then the bloom. The tulip poplar can be found in all 120 counties in the state, and actually in 2012, it was determined to be the most important tree in the state because it made up 12% of the standing volume. If we go back and look at the life cycle of a tree, our wildlife are going to be depending on this tulip poplar from seed to rotting log. Small rodents like squirrels are going to be eating those seeds. Animals that browse on shrubs and saplings like white-tailed deer and wild turkey are going to eat tulip poplars when they are in this stage of life. And on a mature tree, insects love to eat that nectar in those blooms, but I will save pollination for Nikki to talk about tomorrow. So we talked about how wildlife eat trees in the seed stage and the sapling stage, and a little bit about living trees, but now we have moved to the living portion of the life cycle. Here we have a picture of a living bur oak. We also have one of a shagbark hickory. Both of these species are native to the state of Kentucky. Living trees can support a variety of organisms in the state of Kentucky in a variety of ways. Food, shelter, reproduction. They can be used as sites to just get shelter or to hunt off of. I don't know about you, but my favorite thing to do when I am in the car as a passenger is to look out the window in the tree line. And what am I looking for? I'm looking for raptors or birds of prey like hawks, falcons, owls, and maybe even eagles. I'm looking for them at the tops of the tree. And oftentimes they're looking down at the ground. And what are they doing? They're hunting. They're looking for snakes and rodents. And it might be easier to do in the wintertime because there are no leaves on the tree, but that is my favorite thing to do when I'm in the car, and I suggest that you do that next time you're in the car as well.
Got a question. Susan wants to know what tree you recommend to property owners who want to support the most wildlife.
Like I said, okay. So Susan would like to know what tree to plant in her yard to attract the most wildlife. Like I said, those oaks, hickories, and beeches, those trees that are going to produce the most nuts and acorns are going to be the ideal species that you want to have in your yard. So next, we talk about nesting. Robins are a very common species in Kentucky that are going to nest in living trees, as well as bald eagles. Bald eagles can commonly nest in snags too, but eagles nest in pairs and they stay together in that pair for life. They also return to that nest each year after year, and they continue to add sticks and twigs to that nest for stability. These nests can weigh up to 2,000 pounds sometimes, so they like to choose trees that are living, that are huge, that might be an old growth tree for that support. Next, we have a snag. Now, a snag refers to a standing, dead, or dying tree. And this can happen for many reasons. Maybe their needs weren't being met. Maybe the tree wasn't getting enough water, or maybe there was a drought that year. Maybe it got struck by lightning, or maybe it has damage from an insect. But ultimately, this tree has died, but it is still standing. It's bad news for the tree, but great news for a lot of Kentucky wildlife, and that includes the pileated woodpecker. The pileated woodpecker is what we call a primary cavity nester. That means they are going to take advantage of this weak, decaying, dead wood, and they are going to actually excavate and do the work to make a hole in that tree so they can have a nursery for their young. But we also have wildlife like the eastern screech owl and raccoons that are called secondary cavity nesters. These wildlife take advantage of all of that work that the pileated woodpecker did, and they use those cavities to nest their young. They can also be great foraging spots. Insects, there are common wood borers that lay their eggs in trees. So if you ever hear a woodpecker pecking on a tree, it could be making a nest because it is that primary cavity nester. It could also be trying to attract a mate, but it could also be foraging for insects that are under that bark. Bats also use snags to hide, maybe for shelter. Josh, if you want to bring that picture here. This is a bat using bark that is peeled away, maybe on a snag, to seek shelter, maybe from the elements or a predator. Lastly, we have decaying trees. And you might have seen a lot of decaying trees maybe in the woods if you were hunting or hiking and just thought maybe that tree was no longer serving any purpose, but you would be wrong. Decaying trees provide many things. They provide warm, moist habitats for salamanders and snakes. They're great hiding spots, but snakes and salamanders also use these warm, moist habitats for incubation for their young. These wildlife do not provide care to their young once they've laid their eggs or given birth to live young potentially. So they are going to take advantage of that decaying, warm, moist wood for their young. Decaying trees are also great substrate for new growth. It can prevent overbrowsing, maybe deer. It can prevent them from eating too many of those young seedlings and saplings. And once a snag by the water has fallen into the water, that provides great habitat for things like turtles. Yeah, as you can see here in this picture, we have some sliders that are using a dead tree to bask in the sun. Those trees can also be used for hiding or maybe for breeding ground. They provide great habitat for fish in the water. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, what's the fastest growing native tree?
I would say, I'm not sure what exactly is the, what?
Repeat the question.
Oh, so the question is, what is the fastest growing native tree? I'm not really sure what the exact answer to that question is, but there are many native trees like the American sycamore that are very fast growing trees. The sycamore is a water-loving species, but those fast growing trees, while you might want to plant them in your yard because you want to have those benefits for wildlife very soon, that just means their branch structure might not be as strong as those slower growing oak trees. So ultimately, it is worth the wait to plant those trees that are going to have a sturdier structure, but they just might take a lot longer to grow.
Another question, Nikki. Should you consult a biologist or a forester before you remove snags?
Yes, thank you, Nikki. That is a great question. She asked, should you consult a biologist or a forester before you leave those snags in your yard? That is a very great idea. Snags are dead wood and they're still standing, so they can potentially pose a hazard. You always want to consult a forester before you decide to leave one in your yard to make sure that it is not going to be a threat to you or your home. Do we have any more questions? That's it for now? Okay. So I challenge you, maybe next time as you're staying healthy at home, to look outside your window and see if you can see a tree in each of these stages. Can you go outside and find an acorn in your yard, or maybe a tree that has dead wood? Like Rachel suggested, grab some binoculars, see if you can find wildlife, maybe a robin or a cardinal, could be a woodpecker or a squirrel. See if you can find an animal that is using that tree in a certain type or in a certain point in the life cycle to their advantage.